thought to myself, I don't want to be a Muslim. So I put away all the books. But one of the, when I was doing that, a lot of books fell off the shelf. And one of the books that fell off the shelf was the Quran. And when I picked it up, my hand was on Surah 22, ayat 46. And it says, it's not the eyes that are blind, but the hearts.
The rise of the right across Europe is a worrying trend. For over a decade, several suited yet malign individuals have sought to capitalise on the failures within liberal capitalist societies. Often, figures like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands and Douglas Murray in Britain have placed Islam as the enemy within, pitting the West in an existential crusade against Muslims. Those who follow my writing on the issue know that these often slick politicians utilise thinly veiled dog whistles to foment hatred in their populations, channeling the inevitable attacks and even atrocities against ordinary Muslims on the street, or as has been demonstrated in New Zealand, in killing sprees where lives are shattered. This white nativism, a racialised identity that sees migration in general and Muslim migration specifically to be the source of Europe's decline, is growing in momentum, and as the global recession develops, it is only likely to rise. Yet amid this trend, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala finds ways to change the hearts of men. My guest today, Joram van Klaveren, knows full well about the far right in Europe. This is because he was one of them. As a leading member of Wilders' Dutch PVV party, an MP in Parliament, he argued for a Netherlands without Islam. This was until he decided to write a book to attack Islam, and his research ultimately led him to embracing the faith. Today he calls for Europe to reconsider its irrational hatred against Muslims. I asked Joram to tell us about his story and explain how the far right functions and the challenge Muslims in Europe and beyond face from this phenomena. Joram van Klaveren, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's a pleasure to have you on the Thinking Muslim podcast.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Well, it's a great honor for me to be here. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, no, Jazakallah khair. I've been waiting for this interview for some time because I really feel that you will be able to give us some understanding of the emergence of the far right, not only in your country, the Netherlands, but also across Europe, and what this means for Muslims living in the continent. I know a lot of my listeners are quite worried about the rise of the right. And of course, many of the Muslim communities across Europe are disempowered. They don't really have the tools to deal with these trends. A lot of these communities are first or second generation communities. They tend to come from the working classes. And so they don't seem to have the tools to deal with these emerging political trends. And I really would like to get your perspective as an insider, really, or someone who was an insider probably, and how you feel our community can best deal with this trend. Now, some of my listeners will not be aware that you are uniquely placed to give us a better understanding of these trends. Can you please tell us about your background before you embraced Islam?
Well, I used to be a member of the Dutch Parliament, and I was a spokesman on the topic of Islam for the Freedom Party. And the Freedom Party, that's like the most anti-Islamic nationalistic party in the Netherlands, perhaps even in Europe. And perhaps some of the listeners saw the party leader. His name is Geert Wilders, it's the guy with the blonde hair.
Yes.
So I was like his. I was a personal friend as well, but I was also the what they call here the crown prince. So I was the guy who spoke for the party when it came to topics of Islam, integration, immigration, subjects like that. So. But in 2014, I left the party, and I was there from 2008, 2009. And first I was a policymaker, behind the scenes, so to say. And after that, I became a member of the city council. I was the leader of the provincial states here for the Freedom Party, and I ended up in Parliament, in the national Parliament. There was a rally in election time, and he's 100,000 people, and he asked them, "Do you want more, or do you want less Moroccans in the Netherlands?" And everybody starts screaming, "Less, less, less." So it was kind of twisted scene, and he said, "Well, I'll make that happen if people vote for me." But I was the spokesman on this subject, of course. But I wasn't there in the same city. I was in another city where we also had our own constituency, so to say. And so I asked him, "What is this? Is it something new?" Or because of course I was very anti-Islamic, but I wasn't per se anti-Moroccan or anti-Turkish or anti-Belgium or whatever. So he said, "Well, yeah, this is something new." And a lot of people don't know, but there are people with a Turkish or Moroccan or even Afghani background who work for the Freedom Party. Of course, they're not Muslims. Most of the time, they are ex-Muslims. Or they were raised in a very secular way, so they don't have anything with Islam. Perhaps only the thing that their grandparents were Muslim or something. But they're very anti. So, but they were, in a way, of course, our friends, because we fought the same fight. And I told them it's kind of a betrayal to say we want less Moroccans in the Netherlands in general, because we have people working for us as well. And he said, well, that's in a way collateral damage. And I said, yeah, well, I'm not into the very ethnic thing. It's more, I really hated Islam because I thought it was a dangerous ideology and all the things that terrorism and, well, perhaps we'll talk about that later. Yeah. But so it wasn't an ethnic thing for me. It was really an ideological thing. So we got into this fight. At the end, I said, well, you have to change this, otherwise I'll leave the party. He said, well, I don't think you will leave the party. But I, of course, left the party. And then I finally had the time to write an anti-Islamic book. And it was like a whole long-held desire of mine, because normally when you're in politics, it's only one-liners. And I wanted to explain in an academic way why we as the Freedom Party, or me as a person, thought that Islam was very dangerous, why I thought it was something bad for society in general. And but of course, you don't have the time, first of all. And then Wilders was the only person who wrote books on this topic. He was in a way the poster boy of the anti-Islam movement. So. But now I was free in that sense. So I thought to myself, well, I start writing this book. So I started writing, but during the writing, and I give you the short version, otherwise we don't have enough time, I think. But during the writing, I came across so much information that was at odds with the things I thought I knew, that it changed my perception. And I wrote to Abdul Hakim Murad, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad from Cambridge University. I asked him a lot of questions, and I put a little link of my Wikipedia page, which was also in English. So I thought, because I didn't want him to have the feeling that I was tricking him or something. But I wanted to have the correct information, because of course when I would publish a book and it wasn't correct, everybody would start laughing, of course, because he doesn't know where he's talking about. So I thought I have to ask Muslim scholars as well, of course, and he is of course a big scholar. So I asked him about a lot of things. And he said to me, well, I can answer you, but if I answer you, you have to read these books, these articles, etc., etc. So that's what I started doing, and it took me a long time. But in the end, it changed my perception in such a way that I start admiring the Prophet. It's not so much Islam, but more the life of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and the way he dealt with a lot of issues, social issues, but also the view that I had from my own religion, because I was brought up in a Protestant tradition. And the Protestant tradition I was from, it's not so much that my parents taught me to hate Muslims or something, but I was kind of a nerdy guy, so I read a lot of books. And when I was reading the books from the big names of this tradition, like Martin Luther and Calvin, those persons were very anti-Turkish and anti-Islam. And they even wrote about the Prophet that he was, like, in a way, the Antichrist, so Dajjal himself. So that influences, of course, the way you think, especially when you read it as a youngster. So for the first time, when I was reading the book of Martin Links, Life of the Prophet, based on the earlier sources, it really changed the way I saw him, because it was the first time that I saw him as a father and as a friend and as a teacher and as a statesman. So it's changed my perception of him in such a way that in the end I ended up as a Muslim. So this is the short version. Otherwise, I think it's taking too much of your time.
Well, no, it's an amazing story, and really, I'm sure some of my listeners from around the world would find that inspiring. When you were in Geert Wilders' PPV party, you said you were a spokesman on Islam, and I suppose migration is a big theme, especially after the financial crisis in 2008. There was across Europe, Islam and migration became a a rallying call for the far right. What types of views informed your perspective on Islam? I know you talked about your upbringing and your Protestantism, and there was a subtle anti-Islam inbuilt within your reading of some of those scriptures and books. But you were with Geert Wilders. What were the main ideas that informed your perspective on what Islam and Muslims were?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's very important to have like a distinction between what the party said and what I believed.
Right.
Because I think in a way I was even more radical than what the party said.
Really? Right.
And because the party is a secular organization. Geert Wilders, he's not a religious person. And most of the people there, let's say when I started, because the party was founded in 2006, the Freedom Party. So I was there from pretty much the beginning. In 2005, I already had contact with him. He was saying, well, I'm starting a new party, etc. And I knew him from another political party. And we were in the same political party before. Yes. It's the party of Mark Rutte, our current prime minister. So we were both a member of that party. So I knew, and of course, I was still a student, so I was young. Of course, from a Protestant tradition, and he isn't from a Protestant tradition. And I was really religious in that sense. So like I said, I read a lot of books, and it really influenced my way of thinking, because for me, my whole journey and my fight in a way against Islam had to do with religion, because I thought, well, we have the truth with a capital T, and Christianity is under siege in a way. That's because of secularism, but it's also, and I thought that was the biggest problem, Islam. So when I joined the Freedom Party, it was like also a religious duty to fight Islam. Of course, the Freedom Party is a secular party. So there is no religious base or whatever in the party itself. So when he started it, it was from a religious perspective as well. But a lot of people in the beginning, they joined the party, and those people were most of the time religious Christians. And one of them was me. So for us as a person, we had another drive in a way than the drive of the party. But in the end, we linked in that way that we both wanted to fight Islam. But a good example of that is the position of the Freedom Party when it comes to Israel and my own, because my own perspective had to do with theology as well, because in certain Protestant environments, you just support the people of Israel because of some biblical texts. Well, that's another discussion, but that's why I thought we have to support the country, the people, etc. But the Freedom Party said, well, we don't care about your theology. We don't care about religion. We don't even care about the Jewish people as a Jewish people. We support the Jewish people because it's a proxy war. We fight against Islam and they fight our fight. So it's like a Western base in the Middle East. That's how they saw it. So in the end, I said, I don't care as long as we do the same thing when it comes to action. People with different mindsets can do and join the same program in a way.
Wow.
But yeah, the Freedom Party was very strict when it came to fighting Islam. They wanted to shut down all Islamic schools in the Netherlands. They wanted to ban the Quran. They wanted to shut down all borders for migrants from Islamic countries. So it was pretty harsh in that way as well.
Muslims, if I'm not mistaken, make up around 5% of the population in the Netherlands. Now, it doesn't seem like there is a substantial constituency of Muslims to have provoked such animus against Islam. Why did the PPV party, have such hatred against Islam, and why the focus just on Islam?
Well, I think it has to do with history, first of all, because, and that's not only in the Netherlands, but also in whole of Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, because of the history with the Ottoman Empire. And there have been a lot of clashes, of course, between the Ottoman Empire and that's something you saw with the terrorists in New Zealand, in Christchurch as well. Yeah, the guy who killed over 50 people in the mosque. And he had a rifle, like an AK something, and there were a lot of numbers on the AK. And people in the news here said, well, he wrote down how many victims he wanted to make. But people from the far right knew that there was something else, because he wrote, for example, 16A3. 732. And those are the years of battles between Europe and Islam, in a way. And 1683 is the last battle, of course, between the Ottoman Empire and the Christian West. And the West won. And for some people in the far right, especially the extreme ones, they say, well, we're still in this war. And those were two battles, but we're fighting the third battle now. So that's why he wrote that down. And so it has to do with history as well, because a lot of people are living the past in a way. And because they see, well, Islam was the historical enemy. It's a threat to our way of thinking, our way of living, our freedom, etc. So that's one thing. Then, of course, you have a lack of information, because a lot of people really don't know about Islam. And like you said in the beginning, I don't know if it was recorded or this hour before, a lot of people came here in the 60s and 70s. But most of the people who came then, those people weren't scholars. They were just working class people. So when it came to religion, if people started asking questions or founding institutions when it comes to knowledge, etc., of course, that wasn't there. So the views here that people have when it comes to Islam had to do with what they see on the news or with terrorism, because, of course, it is true there have been terrorist attacks in Europe. And if that's the only thing you see, and you have this historical bias, and it's a part of racism as well, of course, because most of the people who are Muslim or born Muslims don't look like native Europeans. So the combination of those factors make it that make sure that a lot of people are very biased against Islam. And another aspect that's very important, and a lot of people don't talk about it, that's secularization. Because secularization in the West has gone up in an extreme way. But because of the secularization, people, they don't understand religion anymore. They really don't understand religious feelings anymore. And they don't have any knowledge about religion. So if you have a lot of people who became secularized over the decades, let's say the last 5-6 decades, and then there is this group of people who are still very religious, that clashes, of course, especially when it comes to morals and when it comes to norms and what you think is normal and what the other person thinks is normal or what is important. And because, of course, this talk is about the far right, but I think it's a problem on the left as well, because on the right, people don't like Muslims because of ethnicity or nationality, and part of it's kind of racist. But on the left side, it's like, I call it mental colonialism. They pet you like you're like a puppet. Oh, come here, you poor little Muslim. We help you. We're the left. We give you some money, a job, and whatever. But at the same time, you have to say, well, you're not really a religious person. Or when it comes to women, or when it comes to family or sexuality or whatever, you have to think the same as we do. So this, as a Muslim, I think, but it's my personal view, you're in between, because both sides aren't really your friend in a way, because they don't leave you with your own freedom to develop you and to live your life in a way that you want. So I think that's a big problem. And the strange thing is that a lot of right-wing people, especially in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands is a very liberal country, the right-wing organizations aren't conservative here. There's just one, yes, maybe two, who are conservative. But when it comes to the moral issues, like the culture wars, as they say in the United States, left and right are the same here. Right. So when it comes to sexuality, like I said, or the family or other, except of those two parties here in the Dutch parliament, yes, but most of them, they think alike. So when they attack Muslims because of, let's say, traditional values, they do it both. It's the left and the right. But they just explain it in a different way.
No, I think that's very fascinating. And often Muslims across Europe, when they feel the heat from, say, the right, they feel that their home is with these left-wing parties. But as you quite rightly describe, often the same sort of discrimination with a different logic is applied to these parties. Yeah. Now, Joram, you said in an article that when you became a Muslim, it was like a religious homecoming to me. I want to understand what went through your mind when you became a Muslim. Like, why was Islam so natural for you when you embraced it?
Well, as a youngster, of course, when you are 16 or 17, that's the first time for most people, that you start perhaps a little bit earlier, that you start thinking about who you are, like identity development. What do you believe? Why do you believe? Is there a hereafter? Politics, whatever. All those the big questions in life, in a way. You start thinking about it. And of course, because I was from a Protestant tradition and a kind of a nerdy guy, like I said, I read a lot of books. Of course, when you dive into Christian theology, you bump into the Trinity. And when you go to church, it's not that they talk about Trinity all the time, of course, because it's a very complex and abstract concept. So, but I wanted to understand what I was believing. So, and when I was trying to understand the Trinity, I couldn't, because I thought it was illogical. Because when you say you are God and you are man at the same time, well, that means that you are eternal and mortal at the same time. It's like a square circle or something. So I thought it's not logical. And when you read the Old and especially the New Testament, when you read the New Testament and you see what Jesus himself said about God, then you see that he didn't say that he was God. Because in the end, there was this just a little story in the New Testament, and there was this guy who approaches Jesus and he asks him, "What do I have to do to gain paradise? How can I go to heaven?" And Jesus says, "Well, there are two things, just two things. If you do that, then you go to heaven." But he says it's hard. It's hard to do that because people think it's easy, but it's very hard. First, and he says, and he repeats the Shema, as they call it in the Old Testament, and it's, "O Israel, hear your Lord is one. There is one God." So it's like Tawheed. He says one God, one God, one God. And he said the other thing is that you have to treat your neighbor as you want to be treated yourself. Well, if you do that really truthful, it is very hard, of course, especially the last thing. But I thought to myself, well, if even Jesus says there is just one God, then perhaps there is just one God and not a complex concept of three gods in one. So I started asking some ministers, and I even went to a Catholic priest. And I'm from Protestant tradition, so it wasn't it wasn't the normal thing to do. But I thought, well, perhaps it's an older church, perhaps they have some knowledge I don't have. But they couldn't give me any satisfying answers. So there was one thing, and then of course you have the atonement, and you have original sin. And I thought, well, if you read the Old Testament, there is this part that the prodigal son, I don't know if you know the story, that there's this guy who leaves. There's a father, you have two sons. One son is very good son, and he does everything that the father says. And the other one says, well, I want my share already. When you die, I get my share, but I want it now. And the father says, okay, if you want that. And he gives him the money, and he leaves. And he's just partying and doing all these things. And when he comes back, he's very poor because he spent all his money. He did some stupid things. And he said, well, I'm not worthy to come back in a way. But his father says when he comes, well, welcome. Let's celebrate. My son is back. So, and Jesus is the one who tells this story. And it's in the Old Testament as well. But in the New Testament, Jesus tells the story. But I thought to myself, and he was just trying to explain how God is when people repent. So when you do tawbah in a way, you say sorry, and you ask for forgiveness, etc. So, and he starts explaining this story, and I thought to myself, well, the atonement, so that Jesus Christ had to die for the sins of man, is almost contrary to this story, because if you say God forgives if you ask him for forgiveness, that's something else, and that you say, well, he has to kill his own son first. So those questions, I was very unsatisfied with the answers I found in the Christian tradition. But of course, I was 16, 17, maybe 20 years old later on when I reread it, everything. But so I said to myself, I'd set it aside and I just live my life as a Christian person. But in the end, when I was starting writing my book, I was a little bit older, those questions popped up again. So I thought to myself, oh yeah, those were those things. And I was reading the Islamic answers now. And of course I knew it because I studied comparative religion at the Free University. So I knew about the concept, and I never looked at it in an existential way. So I never thought about it as the truth with a capital T. It was just the object of study. But now, because I was doubting my own Christian religion in a way, especially the core dogmas, I saw this Tawhid concept. I said, well, it's exactly what Jesus said. And it's what the Jews believe, because when I read the Old Testament, it's the same Bible as the Christians and the Jews when it comes to the first part. I thought, well, that's more logical. So I thought, well, okay, I can embrace this concept of one God. But I was very glad back then that there was still this distinction between me and the Muslims in the character and the person of Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him. So the first stage was me, and I thought, well, so it's kind of Jewish in a way, maybe Unitarian, Christian, etc. So I thought to myself, okay, I can accept that. But later on, of course, when I was reading about the Prophet and his life, and it was so inspiring, and the things that he said, and it was so contrary of the things I thought that I knew about him and his life and his way of thinking and his being, etc. So he changed from this crook in my head into this hero, and it's kind of strange, of course. And it took me a couple of years. It's not that it was one day or just a week, but it took a long time. But in the end, there was this story about Hind, and it was the story for me that was like the switch. Because, like I said, I thought he was like a crook, a bad man, harsh, war-loving. But of course, the story of Hind, and you know the story a lot better perhaps than I do, so correct me if I say something wrong. But Hind was, of course, the wife of Abu Sufyan, and Abu Sufyan was an enemy of Islam and an enemy of the Prophet, of course. And she gave, in a way, money to someone to kill his favorite uncle, Hamza, in the battlefield. And it was what happened. And then they cut off his ears and his nose, and they start parading with his body parts. And I was reading this book, and I thought, okay, where is the part? Because I saw Muhammad came into power in Mecca, but Hind was still there. So I said, okay, where is she crucified? Their heads get cut off or whatever. Then I was reading, and then someone told him, well, Hind is here as well. And he said, well, I cannot look at her now, but everybody here is forgiven. So bloodshedding is over. And if you want to stay here, you can stay here and live among the Muslims. If you don't want to go. And I thought to myself, well, that's remarkable. How is it possible that the man I thought was like the Antichrist forgives the person that kills his favorite uncle, and in such a way that in the end she even became a Muslim? So that was, for me, I was like, well, I think I got it all wrong. So I started rereading everything again because I wanted to be 100% sure. And I told it a few times now, and it sounds a little bit like a fairy tale, but it really happened. In the deck here, yeah, you cannot see it now, but there's this, just like you have, like a bookshelf. And when I thought to myself, I don't want to be a Muslim. I figured it out. I said, okay, I think they are right, but I just don't want to be a Muslim because all my friends are anti-Muslim. I'm working for an anti-Islamic organization. Now I'm in parliament because I was still in parliament as an anti-Muslim MP. Later on, after I left politics, I was working for a very Christian broadcasting organization. I was the voice of the conservative Christians on the radio here. So I thought to myself, all the family, of course, Christian, and a lot of people who were my friends were very secular, but nobody was Muslim, and they didn't have anything with Islam. So I thought to myself, that's something I don't want to go. that's the wrong direction in a way. So I put away all the books. But when I was doing that, a lot of books fell off the shelf, and one of the books that fell off the shelf was the Quran. And when I picked it up, my hand was on Surah 22, Ayat 46, and it says it's not the eyes that are blind, but the hearts. No. And then I thought, well, that is, I think, my problem, because it's not that I cannot see what I wrote down myself. Nobody forced me to write this book. Nobody told me you have to say this, and I wasn't threatened or whatever. I just wrote it down because that's what I found out. But I still didn't want to be a Muslim. So I knew the truth, but I didn't want it. So I thought, it's not my eyes. I can perfectly see with my eyes what I wrote down. I can perfectly see what is written down in the past by other people who know a lot more about Islam than me, but I just don't want it. So it's like your heart is closed. So after that, I did a little like a dua. And I said, I don't really care if it's a God of the Bible or the Quran or whatever. If there is a God, let it be clear for myself which God proclaims the truth. And when I woke up, I felt very secure in a way. And I thought to myself, well, I think I gonna be Muslim. And it took even a couple of weeks, and then I did Shahada.
MashaAllah, alhamdulillah. That's a really amazing story, actually, about how you embrace Islam. I often speak to converts or reverts to Islam who they come to Islam through a set of religious or existential questions which bring them to the true spirituality. And as you know, we refer to that as your fitra, your human disposition to believe in God,
Yeah.
and to want to believe in the truth. But also I find that some converts, not all of them, some converts, they find it very difficult to negotiate with their past. So they may hold a series of concepts, they may hold a series of customs and habits, which, it may be individual things like drinking and how do we get rid of this from our lives? Or there may be broader things that they have to negotiate. Now, you were a member of a far-right party, so you held a host of views, which we would regard as being racialized views, racist views, right? And you would have held a series of views about justice and what is justice from a secular or from a religious Protestant perspective that you held. How did you negotiate these ideas? How quickly were you able to come to terms with some of the perspectives you held, which were now alien to the Islamic notions of justice?
As a member in of the Freedom Party, it wasn't that I embraced all the things. And of course, I was a member and I was an MP, but like everybody in all different religious groups, and even especially in political groups, you just adopt the program in a way. But you still have your personal views, because when it came to, for example, sexuality, just like I told you earlier, I wasn't 100% Freedom Party, because I was much more conservative than they were. But I said, well, that's my collateral damage. I said, well, I accept that as long as we fight Islam, I don't care. By all means necessary, like Malcolm X once said. And that's really how I thought. I don't care as long as we do it, as long as we fight Islam. I can take a lot what I don't agree with in a way. So when it comes to a lot of moral issues, there weren't for me personal, there weren't too many bumps. So I could perfectly have a good night with Muslims. And we would talk about the things of life, not so much politics, and that wouldn't be a problem back then. I didn't do that, of course, because I didn't know so many Muslims, but that would be possible. But when it comes to other things like eating pork, stuff like that, I stopped eating pork when I was, I think, 16 or 17. And that had to do with the fact that I got pimples when I was eating. So it had nothing to do with religion, but it made it easier later on. So no, but the other, really big things, the only thing that really changed is that I became, I think, in a way, softer.
Really?
Yeah, my heart is softened in a way, because when you look at immigration, I still think that the whole immigration policy in Europe isn't a policy that you can maintain in this way. But I think you should look at, for example, Singapore. I think they have it's like a balanced system, and in the Netherlands, and I think in a big part of Europe, there is no balance anymore. So that's something. But now, and perhaps that has to do with the fact that you became a father and older, but also I noticed when I became a Muslim, I became a little bit softer. When you see little children as refugees, of course, you cannot say that you don't care, because back then I also cared, but I didn't look at it. I just thought, okay, it's a big problem, immigration. But now, and it's, of course, I'm not in politics anymore, but now you see the people, and of course, in a way, you're Ummah, so it's part of your community also. So it changes your views in that it makes it more personal in a way. So it's more of the heart and not so much of the closed mind.
Maybe to finish off this conversation, I want to understand a little bit more about the far right and how how this challenge is growing and how Muslims should respond to this challenge. I mean, you have someone who's got experience of this trend. Do you think that the trend is on the rise, and how do we address this?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question, of course. But yeah, I think that Abdul Hakim Murad, he wrote a book. It's called Traveling Home. I think it's his latest book. And there's one thing that I found fascinating, and I think it's true, and it has to do with the fact that Muslims sometimes don't really take pride in their religion. So they say, I'm a Muslim, but they don't live up to the word of Muslim in a way. And they don't act like Muslim because, and I mean this in a positive way, you can be proud of who you are. And especially when you're a Muslim, I think if you really believe that you have the truth, the absolute truth, then you should be proud of that truth, and you should be sharing that truth, and you should show other people, especially people who are not Muslim, why you think that they live a life that's not the truth. So if you want to have them and you want to persuade them, show them success in a way. Don't be a victim. Sometimes, and that has to do with social, economical factors as well, of course, but just be the best you can be all the time. That will change people, their perception. I've seen it here, because a lot of people here thought, well, I see Muslims as nasty people, they do this, and terrorists, etc. Until they start knowing Muslims and they see really Muslims that live up their life and they live like Muslims. They say, whoa, that's very impressive. I didn't know that you do that. I didn't know that. You're very kind. You're warm persons. You're caring for your neighbors, etc. And that changes their perception. So I think, and that's just one thing. And of course, we don't have too much time, but the next conversation, inshallah, we'll talk about this a little bit more. But I think that the personal living of Islam is very important. And of course, there are a lot of people who call themselves Muslim, but they don't act like Muslims. On the contrary, even. And that influences people who only see what they see on the news and they don't know Islam. Because I always say people, non-Muslims, they don't read Quran, they don't read Hadith, they read you. They read you. And that's how the Indonesians, for example, became Muslim back centuries ago, because they saw the behavior of the Muslims, the businessmen who visited Indonesia, and they were so impressed by it that they said, we want what they have, and they became Muslim. So it's just the akhlaq in a way. It's very, very important.
Joram van Klaveren, I know you have to go. Jazakallah khair for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, and like I said, I hope we can have this conversation again.